On behalf of the Board of Trustees and the entire staff of the National Building Museum, I am delighted to welcome all of you here tonight for this very special program. My name is Chase Rind, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director here at the museum. And it is my great honor to have all of you with us on this wonderful occasion, which is the 2018 Vincent Scully Prize. The Vincent Scully Prize is always a very special evening. So many of our friends and colleagues join us for what is truly a unique honor within the field. And I want to thank all of you for celebrating with us tonight, as you have in years past. The National Building Museum was established nearly 40 years ago as the nation's leading cultural institution devoted to the history and impact of the built environment. We have raised public awareness about the many historic, social, and cultural issues associated with the buildings and the landscapes that shape our world. One of the most important and enduring ways the National Building Museum accomplishes this is through the Vincent Scully Prize. The prize was established in 1999 in partnership with architect David M. Schwartz to honor contributions to the study, teaching, and public understanding of the built environment. The museum is very grateful to David for his years supporting this prize, and we thank him for his vision in establishing this prestigious award. Unfortunately, David could not be with us here this evening, but I would like to recognize Derek Marks, who is attending tonight on behalf of David and his firm. So thank you for being here, Derek. The prize is selected by a jury who are themselves scholars and experienced practitioners in architectural scholarship and criticism, architecture, landscape architecture, historic preservation, planning, and urban design. I do want to thank jury members James Corner and Maurice Cox, who were unfortunately not able to join us this evening, but I do want to thank jury members Ellen Denham Jones, Blair Kamin, and our jury chair, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, who is, by the way, a former laureate of the prize, and all three of them are with us tonight. So please join me now in welcoming Liz to the podium to begin our program. Thank you.
Good evening. To start this evening's program, I would like to remember two men whose influence on the built environment is legendary: Vincent Scully and Robert Venturi. Of each, it has been said that he changed the course of American architecture. And their influence on generations of scholars, architects, urban designers, clients, patrons, and civic activists is immeasurable. Architecture historian Vincent Scully, after whom the prize is named, passed away almost a year ago. Last month, architect Robert Venturi followed. It is fitting that we remember Scully and Venturi together, as their paths were intertwined and mutually elevating. Their writings heralded the postmodern recall to history and live on as reminders that the profession's past holds a richness that can edify and inspire and should not be squandered. Scully's American Architecture and Urbanism called attention to the traditional form of the urban public realm and the regrettable neglect, at the same time, of the historical beauties of American cities. Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction, sometimes called a gentle manifesto, with an introduction by Vincent Scully, suggested that modernism was in need of the enrichment that both men admired in the classical roots of Western architecture. Scully turning to Greece, which he first experienced during World War II, and Venturi, who spent years in Rome. Still appropriate 50 years later are Venturi's words in that book. An architecture of complexity and contradiction must embody the difficulty of inclusion rather than the easy unity of exclusion. And Scully's students are still guided by the conviction that the past and present are one. The inaugural Vincent Scully Prize, made possible by his grateful student David Schwartz, was given to its namesake. 4 years later, its recipients were Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, thus setting a direction for the award that has recognized those whose written reflections on design have had a beneficial effect on our cities and communities. This evening, we continue this direction, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's recipients of the 18th Vincent Scully Prize, Robert Campbell and Inga Saffron. Architecture writers and critics who speak to a public audience, interpreting contemporary architecture and defending the built representations of our history. Robert Campbell has been the architecture critic for the Boston Globe for several decades. With degrees in English, journalism, and architecture, and informed by his own experience as a practicing architect, he has written on all aspects of the built environment. His work has received numerous awards, including from the National Endowment for the Arts and the American Institute of Architecture, and he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1996. Inga Saffron's Changing Skyline column has appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer since '99. Her work explores how a variety of forces, politics, finances, culture, shape the city and its form. Before her design column, she was a correspondent in Ireland, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union, covering wars in the Balkans and Chechnya. I suppose we could call her fearless. Her work has been recognized with the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard, and she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2014. You will learn more about Robert and Inga this evening in their conversation with my fellow Scully jury member, Blair Kamin, himself a Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune. Blair perfectly summed up for us why these two writers are deserving of the Scully Prize, writing, "These two talented and observant writers reveal how smart, often stinging architecture criticism can raise our consciousness about and expectations for the built environment. At a time of retrenchment in the newspaper industry, when many fret whether serious criticism has a future, their strong, wise voices answer with a resounding yes. By extracting universal lessons about design from such gritty local subjects as, in Bob's case, Boston's Puritan frenzy of urban renewal, or in Inga's case, the street-deadening blight of Philadelphia's garage-fronted townhouses, Campbell and Saffron do what all great critics should. They form an indispensable link between the public, between all of us, and our public realm. I look forward to tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Robert Campbell, Inga Saffron, and Blair Kamin to the stage.
Redundant.
Thank you, Liz. It's great to be here, and thank you to the National Building Museum for hosting this event. As a student of Vincent Scully, it's really an honor to be taking part tonight. And as a journalist, it's a special pleasure to be part of the process of honoring such esteemed colleagues as Bob and Inga. I think all of you know Vincent Scully was an incredible theatrical lecturer. I have vivid memories of being in his talks at the Yale Law Auditorium, which was called Darkness at Noon. And Scully would have this giant pointer, and he would just whack it up against the projection screen, and he would talk about rising and thrusting skyscrapers, and I mean, he really knew how to appeal to sex-crazed undergraduates. Most of all, and really most important, Scully enlarged the constituency for architecture by making architecture and urbanism accessible to everyone. He made it people care about it. And that's really what the two laureates here are so great at. Though their medium is not the lectern, but the bully pulpit of the metropolitan newspaper, and more recently, of course, its website. Both Bob and Inga write for newspapers in cities whose architectural history stretches back to and even before the birth of the Republic. Both are focused intensely on local issues, and yet they are read globally. Both are masters at delivering assessments that will ruin the breakfast of an architect. Bob with his laser-sharp observations, and Inga with her stinging put-downs. And we will get to those shortly. But first, Bob, who knew Scully, wants to say a few words about him. Bob?
I was asked to say a few words about him by my companion here. Scully, not someone I knew very well. He was at Yale, of course, and I spent a lot of my time in and around Harvard. And among the things he became aware of right away was that he hated and feared Harvard. And he was giving a lecture at the Harvard Club of Boston once, and I was squiring him around, and he was before the lecture. And he became more and more nervous, and he said finally, "I've got to go out and take a walk. I'm just too upset." And but I have been told by people who worked with him at Yale that he would throw together his lectures with enormous sort of freedom of just throwing slides all over the place, and then in the same kind of atmosphere of excitement, you know, that he would found thinking about Harvard. And then he would come and deliver the most wonderful lectures, as if they had been rehearsed over and over again. And he'd say with the latter, I wanted to say one other thing for him. I decided 3 years ago, or 5 years, some 3 decades ago, isn't that what we heard today? That there was a characteristic personality that I had noticed among other people, and there were 3 of them among the winners of the Scully Award. One was Scully, one was Jane Jacobs, and one was Christopher Alexander. And all of them, for me, had the same characteristic that they appeared never to have read a book. They did not refer to them as history or culture. They did not try to position their exact place in the panoply of architects through history. They just went out and looked at something and came home and wrote about it, and that was that. And I think people like that are incredibly invaluable, and all 3 of them, I think, are among the most. The first book of Scully's I read was one that is not so well known, but it was about his, and it certainly follows the picture of him that I've given, the temples in Greece, the ancient temples in Greece. And he developed a whole theory of why they had been located, where they were located, without any reference to what anybody else had said or what anybody else had thought. He was only interested in telling what he himself had understood and perceived. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant, I think. I'll just throw, it'll sound boastful, but I'm going to throw one other comment in. He invented the term the shingle style. Most of them are in New England on the Rocky Coast up through New Hampshire and Maine. And having written a book on the shingle style, I happened to write a column in the Globe about a shingle style house that was endangered. And in order to tell my readers what the hell that meant, I put in a couple of paragraphs defining a shingle style, this thing that he had named. And I got a note from him saying, "You have written better about the shingle style than I ever had." And I thought, what a guy, what an extraordinary personality. And I am here to swear that it's not false. It is false what he said. Thank you.
Okay. I want to start by defining terms and correcting a common misperception of the popular understanding of the word critic. Many people think critic just means you're negative, you're a nag. And in fact, the word critic derives from the Greek word kritikos, which means skilled in judgment, someone who can discern between the meritorious and the mediocre, the good and the bad. Now, this raises the question of how both of you define the critic's role. Are you a judge? Are you a one-man jury or one-person jury? Sorry, Inga. Are you a watchdog, a conscience? What's your role? I mean, let's talk about the critic's role to start. Inga, why don't you start?
You know, I think the critic, the architecture critic in today's journalism landscape is all of those things. I mean, I actually think of myself as a reporter. I often slip and I say I'm the architecture reporter for the Inquirer or writer because, you know, sometimes I am reviewing buildings, you know, and talking about, you know, what's good about them, what's bad about them, what do they mean. Other times I'm reporting on city council or the zoning board or, you know, some kind of backroom deal that shapes ultimately the buildings that get built. So that's kind of a watchdog role, or you know, and more as I write more about things that aren't traditional buildings or architecture, I'm writing about the built environment. But I would say what the starting point is always design and an aesthetic sensibility, and architecture in its broadest sense.
Bob, you've talked about, I think, defining the beat in similar terms with an emphasis on the physical world. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, a couple. First of all, we're very different from very different backgrounds, and I think it's good that critics should all be from different parts of the world because they will stitch together a point of view that will be more complex. But you are a full-time employee of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I am a freelance for the Boston Globe and have been since, I think,
73.
73.
A part-time Pulitzer winner.
And during that time, I have always practiced as an architect. Now, I can't be a registered architect and build buildings under my own name because I don't keep up my registration. What I have done is been a consultant on a number of usually cultural buildings over time, and it's a role that I think there could be a lot more of me doing this. Imagine a cultural institution like the Boston Symphony Orchestra or the Gardner Museum, the two that I've worked with, excuse me. They may know absolutely nothing because they've built a building 100 years ago, and they need that kind of somebody to come in and say, maybe we should start with a program. You know what a program is? And we haven't done a site selection yet. There's a criteria that are going to be involved in that. So that's the first thing I would say. I think of what Inga does as much more important and much more valuable to the city than what I do. I do it much less frequently, and I don't try to do, as you do try to do very successfully, run a running commentary on the quality of the environment. I pick and choose, and you just do that.
They won't let me do it less frequently. They want that column every week.
I wrote once a week when I started out. Didn't last too long. It's amazing how much you can do when you're younger than what you can do when you're older. The other thing I would say about it is an architecture critic has no reason to exist as such. Nobody's going to buy a ticket to go and see a building. It is not. It's the only kind of critic that is not presenting some kind of work of art for you to an audience. And the question then arises, why do you have architecture critics? And the answer, I think, is, and you were just hinting at this, for me, the architecture critic is the guy in the newspaper who writes about the physical world. The physical world that you can touch and smell and bang your head against and climb and go out in the breeze in and look at. But almost everything that's written about architecture in the newspapers that I know, the Times and the Globe primarily, look at it from the point of view of the legal background, who owned what, the financial background, who financed what, the cultural, the political background, which mayor was for it and why was he for it. And you begin to think, if you're not careful, you begin to think of the built world as a bar graph, like you would see it in the newspaper. The buildings kind of pop up because they've been nourished by bankers and lawyers and developers down below in the caverns. And that's certainly true. It has been. And I don't recommend neglecting those important people. But for me, it's important to say the physical world has its own virtues and defects, regardless of who made it and when and for what purpose. There is a physical world that we can talk about and think about without always reverting to these subterranean forces that have created it. So for me, those are 2 or 3 starting points.
Who's the audience? Who are you writing for? Are you writing for architects, specialists? Are you writing for the broad public? Are you writing for both? And can you write for the broad public without dumbing it down?
You know, because I write for a general interest newspaper, which is one of the last sort of mass market institutions left in our society, I am writing for a broad public, people who know nothing about architecture, and I've gotten so many emails that begin, I know nothing about architecture. And you know, I always, and sometimes people criticize me and say, oh, you're not an architect. And I said, that's right, I'm not an architect, I'm a civilian. And I'm experiencing these buildings like any other citizen. And that's why I'm writing for citizens. And I feel just as citizens have a kind of civic obligation to know about, you know, the politics and policy in their environment, they have an obligation to know about you know, how things are built. And of course I try to educate them. I'm a big explainer. You know, I don't want to lose them with jargon. I want to help them understand and help them see, and that requires me to, you know, justify my opinions and explain how I got to that point of view.
Okay. Now that sounds very, almost professorial, tame. Have you ever read Inga Tear into a Building? So actually there's a building in Philadelphia that she really hates. It's called Symphony House. And Inga, I think, I'm going to let Inga read an excerpt from this review. I also have one for you.
Mine are much kinder.
You were pretty tough on IMP's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But let's listen to Inga as she tears apart Symphony House.
This is the review I'm most notorious for. Okay. Except to those who resolutely averted their eyes during construction, it can't come as news that Symphony House is the ugliest new condo building in Philadelphia. The 32-story mixed-use tower flounces onto venerable South Broad Street like a sequined and over-rouged strumpet. Sheathed in a sickly shade of pink concrete, the building resembles, as one blogger wittily observed, a giant Pepto-Bismol bottle. If only it were possible to look away.
Very good.
Now, I'll just add one little thing that was also in this review. The building was cast concrete, stained pink, although the developer insisted it was red, to look like brick. And I explained in the review, and this goes to the point I was making about how I explain things, that when you look at a brick building, brick buildings are not one color. They're not just red. They're dozens, if not hundreds of colors. And your eye takes them in, and it has all this texture and depth. When you stain cast concrete, there really is only one color. And there's, in this case, no depth. So that was part of my. I did go into a lot of effort.
I'm sure that very nuanced explanation of brick really helped the developer and architect feel better. Inga, how did they react to your kind words? I mean, did you hear from them afterwards, and have you run into them since?
Oh yes, oh yes.
And what did they? You know, in Chicago, the customary way of responding to a report like that Rahm Emanuel would be to send a dead fish to the writer.
We're not a dead fish town, but both the architect and developer had letters to the editor that were very prominently displayed. And without going into the long saga of the Inquirer's many financial meltdowns, we were in a very bad patch at that time, and the developer was one of our biggest advertisers.
Oh, great.
So when he had his letter to the editor, it was there was a little notice on the front page referring to the letter on the letters page, which was unprecedented. It's called a reefer. There was a reefer on the front page saying, you know, Carl Dranoff, the developer, responds to Inga Saffron's Symphony House review. So nobody told me that the letter was going into the paper, and I was at an interview, actually. I was looking at another building, and someone said, "Oh, I hear they ran a correction on the front page."
Oh. Wow.
And I thought I was going to lose my job over that.
But you were a Pulitzer finalist that year.
That year I ended up being a Pulitzer finalist.
That's right.
Thankfully.
So
saved my job.
So the forceful column was obviously resonated with your colleagues. Bob, I want to talk about your takedown of I.M. Pei's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame building in Cleveland. Do you want to read the concluding paragraphs of your review?
If it's legible.
Yeah, you probably will remember. It's right here.
The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a bag of old architectural tricks. It is
sorry. It's my bad writing. It's a recycled Louvre
Kennedy
sorry.
Library,
Yep.
the National Gallery. Oh, like fresh must be. It will look fresh
Right. To many visitors.
to many visitors. Did I say this?
It's hard to read your stuff 22
Now
years,
it's getting
22
now
years
it's getting
later.
to some I recognize a little bit.
Okay.
Too much of it is shallow, show-off architecture, the kind you see at a World's Fair or a theme park. No, what is this?
No real risks.
No
have been
real
taken.
risks have been taken, and that
Feels wrong for rock.
for rock. The article was much longer than that, and it was an incredibly bad building that was originally designed for one site in Cleveland, which was up on a bluff overlooking the town, and the whole design was rendered because of, as we were saying earlier, every building has a context, and you've got to respond to your context, and it responded to being a kind of outlook, a kind of fortress kind of thing on the top of this, and then they changed the site. This is where the mayor gets in, right? No, let's put it down by Lake Erie. Well, did they pay I.M. Pei any more for changing the building completely from being up on down to the water? No, he took the same goddamn building and he planted it in Lake Erie, and the elevator comes down into the water, and everything about it is the wrong size and the wrong shape and in the wrong place. And in the uppermost room, which is where the great stars, have their little memorials or whatever they are, I saw the building before it opened, and I knew it was going to be much too small. They had that problem immediately. I will say one thing in relation to what you said. In all the years that I've been writing for the Globe, with thousands of articles, there's only one time that the Globe has ever objected to anything I wrote. There was a department store in Boston called Jordan Marsh. It doesn't exist anymore, but the major department store in Boston. And they built an addition. And I didn't like the addition, and I made that clear. And I got a note from an editor at the Globe, and this is the only time it ever happened. He said, perhaps you didn't know that Jordan Marsh is our largest advertiser and part owner of the Globe. And maybe you don't have to mention its new building every week.
I have to say, say, even though the Inquirer did run those letters to the editor, which I feel was perfectly appropriate, they have never asked me to change a single word for that, because anyone was an advertiser or because they felt I was being too harsh. I've never been edited in that way, and I've been allowed enormous freedom.
But it's really important. It's the ethic of journalism that
Yeah.
is slipping in a lot of places.
All right, now let's ask the critics to critique themselves. If you could take back one piece where you were either too tough, too kind, what would it be?
I'm sure there are a lot of them.
So this is not exactly taking back a piece, maybe several pieces.
Okay.
In the, I guess it was the early 2000s, when cities all over America were obsessed with getting downtown ballparks, because they, downtowns were still struggling to get people to stay after 5 o'clock, and there was a proposal in Philadelphia for a downtown ballpark, and I jumped on that bandwagon. And 15 years later, I look at this city, this downtown that's really transformed remarkably, and I just say to myself, thank our lucky stars they did not build this like mega structure in the downtown, because it would have been a big, dull thing when it wasn't in use, and would have caused all sorts of problems. And at the time I was upset. They put it on the edge of the city near, a tangle of highways, and I thought, what a waste, there's no economic spin-off, blah, blah, blah. But it's good it's down there with the football stadium and all the other stadiums, and they can have their traffic jams. And
Okay, Bob. So you had a lot of time to think about a piece that you can...
I think my tendency is to be too nice, because you're being taken around by the architect, by the owner, by people who really care about the building,
Right.
and they're excited about it, and they get you excited, and
former brainwashing.
they may not notice the little corner over here where things aren't so good. The one I'm going to pick is the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston by, and tell me the architect.
Diller Scofidio?
Diller and Scofidio, Elizabeth Diller and
Scofidio and Renfro, sorry.
now three, yeah. It was the first building of any significance, along with the courthouse by Harry Cobb, in that new part of Boston, which was on filled land near the downtown, now called the Waterfront District, or the Seaport District. And they had the courage to go out to this forgotten piece of land, nothing around it, like a swamp or a piece of filled land, and build this, get the most, what would you call them? Maybe not the most exciting, the most daring architect they could possibly have got. They interviewed 6 of them. They looked very hard at them. They picked Diller and Scofidio, who had never done a building before. They were famous for doing artworks, site-specific artworks, and their artworks were very good. So I got carried away by the building. How nice to get an architect working in Boston who isn't the same old guys that I write about every week, and blah, 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 blah. Well, the Institute of Contemporary Art is not a good building, and the better you know it, the more trouble you have with it. The gallery spaces are no good. The circulation is a complete disaster. There are a lot of problems with it. The entry is in the wrong place. And those are all things that, no matter how you felt in the largest sense about a building, you should always say. That is as good a comment as any, I think.
Okay, that's great. Well, but in both your cases, I think it's fair to say that you don't just write about the building as an object in isolation, as though it were a piece of sculpture. You write about something Bob has written about for years, this idea of place. Place sounds, sort of like apple pie or something like that. What is place, Bob? You've been a real leader in this concept.
A lot of people who teach in architecture schools, including some we know well, regard that as a dirty word, place. They're up to much higher ideals than simply making good places. My definition of architecture is the art of making places. I think I said that earlier, but if I didn't, I meant it. I think that's the best way to think about architecture. And when you think of a place, can be a bedroom, it can be a lawn, it can be a garden, it can be a city, it can be a region, it can be a lot of things. as long as it's been made by human beings for human use, it's architecture, as far as I'm concerned.
What's a great place? Give us an example. Or two.
There's so many of them. Well, I'll name Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. You don't think of a street as a place maybe very ordinarily, but a lot of things happen on a street besides cars and trucks going by. They are sites of life. And on Commonwealth Avenue, which many of you don't know, I know, but it's a boulevard with a green strip down the middle. And the houses on both sides were built in a wealthy era of Boston. And they all put on their kind of front clothes, you know, as if they were being chosen somewhere. All the houses have their best clothes on facing the center of the street on both sides. And so you're at a dinner party where everybody has come in their tuxedo. And when you go around and back, that's where all the garbage is and the little alley that the rats come in on and everybody comes out on. So what I would choose to say about it is that think about places in a broader way. They're not things. Buildings are not things. They are places, and they are in some kind of important relationship to other places, always.
What's a great place in Philly, Inga, that you love?
Well, Rittenhouse Square is one of the greatest places in Philadelphia. It's the living room of the city. There are almost no good buildings, very few good buildings, I should say, on its perimeter, but nevertheless, the way the buildings come to the edge, what's happening on the ground floor, their transparency, all these things work together. They're different textures. Not much got built in Philadelphia for a long time, and it's always been fascinating to me that there's a building from like every decade, starting from like the 1880s into the current moment on Rittenhouse Square. So you have this incredible diversity of styles. It's also the place in the city where the business district meets the residential district. All kinds of people come and use it. It's very permeable. You can just flow right in.
It's magical.
Yeah.
So conversely, one of the selections in your Pulitzer-winning entry talked about this phenomenon of the garage-fronted building. So you live in Philadelphia. You bike around the city. You walk around the city in the same way that Jane Jacobs walked around Washington Square and elicited universal lessons from it. So let's say you lived in the main line, and weren't out and about all the time. Would you have gotten that story? Or did it help that you're, in the place that you're writing about, that it was organic?
I'm very embedded, very embedded in the city. I don't own a car. I bike and walk everywhere.
You're a militant pedestrian.
I'm a militant pedestrian, militant biker. I think it is possible, because the main line is actually closer to downtown Philadelphia than some parts of Philadelphia. So I don't think that necessarily excludes you from understanding the city. Obviously, you might have a slightly different perspective if you had to drive in every day and you were thinking about the traffic jams. I don't think about the traffic jams at all.
Okay, but in other words, being embedded really
being
matters.
Embedded.
Okay.
So, when you're walking or biking, you experience the city at a different pace. It's much more intimate, and if you have to go along a really dull stretch where nothing's going on, or the sidewalks are really narrow, or it's really dark or claustrophobic, it affects your whole mood, and you respond to that. And that's why I've written a lot of columns about garage-fronted row houses, which are I call them Frankenhouses, because they take this traditional Philadelphia form, which is really wonderful, the row house, and they graft on this horrible deformity, which is to turn the living room into the space for the car. And so, although Philadelphia has tried to stop them, there are some new developments where you can go a whole block and all you see are garages and doors.
Yep.
I want to talk about the background of both you, because you come to this beat from very different places. Bob, as Liz mentioned, has training as an architect and has practiced as an architect. You, on the other hand, worked in a series of journalism jobs, culminating before you became the architecture critic in the Moscow correspondent position for the Inquirer, where you covered the Yugoslav and Chechen wars, right? So you're used to the kind of war. So you're used to getting flack
Right.
from
The mayor having a temper tantrum doesn't bother me.
Right.
when you've had bombs dropped nearby.
Okay. But Bob, I want to go back to when you started in '73. For many, people in the audience, Ada Louise Huxtable is sort of the gold standard of architecture, and she won the first Pulitzer for criticism, and I believe it was 1970. Then you started 3 years later. But you very interestingly, didn't follow her path exactly in terms of your writing style in particular. You chose a somewhat different course, and which I think was very courageous. So talk about that. In other words, how did you, Bob Campbell, chart that course in terms of a different path, slightly different path?
I really don't know.
Yes, you do. You've told me about this. Your style is, Ada Louise wrote in this kind of ultra sophisticated Manhattan style. I think you said once that she could pack 10 paragraphs into a single sentence.
She could write very well when she had to be mad to write her best. Maybe that's true of you too, but she has written things that I will never forget when she's been really upset about something.
Like what?
Well, the last thing she wrote was an article for the New York Times on how they were all going to destroy the New York City Public Library,
Right.
which is a great architectural monument of America. And they had a terrible plan, and they were going to do terrible things, and she decided that they were going to be terrible. And she was dying, and I knew her very well, and I saw her probably 10 times over that summer. She had researched the hell out of it. She had got the original drawings, discovered for her own satisfaction what at least had not been made public, which was that the famous reading room on the second level sits on the cast iron book stacks underneath it, so they are one structural concept. What they were planning to do, of course, was get rid of these old-fashioned book stacks. So it was not only that she was smart and thoughtful and everything else, she did her research.
Right.
And I think that's very, very important.
Right. It seems like...
By the way, that her article killed the job within a day or two.
Right. Credibility, conviction, courage, those 3 C's, I think, are the coin of the realm in many respects. They're what give architecture critics their punch. Would you, yes? Agreed or no?
Say it again.
Credibility, conviction, and courage. Those 3 things often produce, some of the best work, because you've done your homework, you've looked at the drawings, that sort of thing.
I've never written about a building I hadn't physically been to and seen. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote about one building that I shall not name that I know. She never was in that city in her life, but I wouldn't tell on her. And it was very valuable, her article.
Okay.
I don't. You can't ask a person to talk about himself. If I'm angry, that helps.
Right.
One of the things I did best, I think, was not writing architectural criticism for the Globe, but doing a bi-weekly feature that I did with a photographer. And the photographer, Peter Vanderwalker, would go and find an old picture of something in Boston. Could be an engraving, it could be whatever, it could be a pencil sketch, it could be a photograph. And he would go out and with incredible skill position himself in the city to take exactly the same picture today, the same framework around. And we did 237 of those pairs, I'm proud to say. One thing in my life I've been consistent about, and published a book about them. And I think that's what we're remembered for, because people looked at these before and after things, and then I would write a paragraph about what had changed and what had not changed, and what were the motives that made one thing rather than the other. And I think it was like a slide lecture in an art history. You put up the Picasso and the something else, and you have two things to talk about. And it's much easier to write. And Peter van der Walker, the great photographer, had a characteristic of never giving me any information about what was in the photograph. He thought, I've done the photograph, I did all the legwork, let him figure it out. And one of the nice things about that is when you don't know what you're looking at, you look very closely.
That is a great book, Cityscapes of Boston. I wrote, when I reviewed it, that it belonged on the bookshelf of anyone who cares about the American city. That's why Bob and I have always been friends. It's a terrific book. I highly recommend it. Both of you have been at your jobs a long time. I mean, Bob for 45 years, Inga for 20. How's the job changed? How have newspapers changed? And how does the declining fortunes, economic fortunes of newspapers affect what you write about? Inga, why don't you take that? Because your recent columns have been about certainly not just reviews of lousy condo buildings. They've been a fascinating takes on all kinds of subjects: equity, affordable housing, zoning. So talk about how you're trying to show the reader why they should care.
So, of course, newspapers have undergone a tremendous upheaval and disruption over the last 20 years. And, nothing is the same, from the way we file, when the fact that our stories always come out on the website first, and we're shooting more of our own pictures. When I started out, I used to be in the culture department, which is a very different environment, and now I'm in what they call news features. I'm in a more newsy environment. But I would say what's really, really changed is cities themselves in the last 20 years, and Philadelphia very dramatically. And I mentioned earlier, this downtown ballpark. When Philadelphia was struggling, really struggling to, get people on the streets after 5 o'clock and revive its downtown. Well, now its downtown is thronged with people, and there's this incredible revival, and there's so much new construction. And so in the span of just 2 decades, the city has gone from a place that people used to refer to as the next Detroit, when Detroit was really, falling off the map. And so we've gone from being, a city in utter free fall to a city where people are worried that we have too much construction, and they worry about gentrification. And I would say the really big change for me is it used to be really exciting when there was a new building and it didn't happen every week, even though I had to produce a column every week. Now there's so many new buildings, I can't write about them all. And I used to write about every new condo tower, but now it feels really indulgent to do that. When there are other issues of, neighborhoods that are left behind by this incredibly rapid gentrification, issues of equity, I think, I've had a gradual realization that just reviewing buildings for the privileged doesn't tell the whole story of what's going on, and that as an architecture critic, I have a responsibility to tell other stories, maybe about what's not being built, parks that aren't being repaired and invested in. So I think the story is much more multi-layered now, and you have to think differently about what you choose to write about, and how you choose to think about design. And I think it's actually much more interesting right now.
Bob, in your 45-year tenure, How would you say, how is your job different, or maybe it's not? I don't know.
Boston went through the same cycle that Philadelphia did. Of course, it was a dead. Nobody in my class at Harvard in 1958 was going to stay in Boston. You had to be completely lacking in ambition or imagination if you were going to stay in Boston. And then it turned around in this unbelievable way, and now it's just building like crazy. When I started writing, it was easy to write, and you said this, I think, easy to write about architecture because there was so little of it. If an interesting building appeared, and I think one thing neither of us has said, but we've both implied, you're like a lawyer when you write about a building. You're looking for what case can you make out of this building. There are a lot of different things you could write about this building. Which argument is going to be telling and make an educational, is going to make through to people, is going to help people think about architecture. And that's always a very interesting decision. And very often when you write, you think you're writing about point A, and a third of the way through you've abandoned that and you're writing on point B because you've thought of you've come to realize that there's some argument in that building that you can use to make a point about architecture.
And one thing that's clearly changed.
I would just add to that again.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
As Inga did, there's so much building going on now. And most of it, because there is such a demand for it, isn't very good. It doesn't have to be very good to be marketable. So it's a very it's a bad time, I think, to be an architecture critic. And I think you going into other things like finances and politics and things like that. I don't do much of that, although other people at the Globe do. But I think it's very important.
I think one of the problems right now is, we call ourselves architecture critics, but so much of what's being built is driven by developers and banks, and they shape the form, and the architect is, just an afterthought. I really feel sorry for a lot of architects because they have so little control over these buildings. And I think if you don't talk about how they get made, you're not being fair to the architects themselves or to your readers. And you're perpetuating, this sort of heroic architect myth that doesn't really, that's not what real life is.
I agree completely with all of that. And it's the commercial architecture, not the institutional architecture that we're talking about, where the money, the bankers, the lenders, the people like that are governing everything. What you might also say is that it leads to, in Boston, 3 architectural firms getting 90% of the commercial work, and so they're running flat. They can't do a good job because they don't have time or money or any. They can't. So it's led to a period of redevelopment, and I'm seeing it in Washington today too, where an awful lot was built very quickly according to very minimal standards of architecture.
I find it very difficult. You can't write a negative review.
I think you should
every week. And if you write about all these developer buildings, which are often not very good, all you're going to do is slam all these buildings. So you have to look for other things to talk about, so you can just mix it up.
Okay, but you're talking about mixing it up. But in the city of Houston, which is the 4th largest city in the United States, there's no architecture critic, and there never has been. In Los Angeles, which is the 2nd largest city in the United States, the critic left the LA Times to become a design aide to the mayor, and the LA Times hasn't replaced him. The Wall Street Journal, which some would argue is the most powerful newspaper in the United States, has periodic architecture criticism, maybe once a month.
That was Ada Louise Huxtable wrote for the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
And it's very much at 30,000 feet rather than in the trenches.
So, in other words, you're trying to mix it up to vary your coverage, but in many cities, there's no coverage.
Well, I wouldn't be quite as pessimistic as that.
Well, in other words, but let's answer this. What are those, in other words, some cities have reporters covering architecture, like in Miami, as we were talking about earlier, but when there's no critic, when there's no critical eye who's a watchdog or someone who raises standards, what are those cities missing?
They're missing a lot. I mean, I don't disagree with you that having a strong unfettered critical voice, establishes a very high benchmark, and you can argue with that person and disagree and whatever, but I just want to push back a little bit because this is one of the big changes since I became architecture critic 20 years ago. I mean, I used to be the only person in Philadelphia writing anything about buildings and parks. And now, well, Philadelphia has a particularly rich group of websites and blogs that, I mean, they don't write about it in the same way I do in a kind of authoritative, critical voice, but they definitely cover all this stuff, and they reflect debates that are going on. And then in addition, there's so many Facebook pages, one called Urban Phil, and you know, lots and lots of them, where there are these furious discussions, interesting discussions. I often get great story ideas reading them. So there's more conversation about architecture than ever before, and it's more accessible.
But wouldn't you say that's the equivalent of like the lightning? That's the lightning bug, and you're the lightning. Seriously, because in other words, the websites and Facebook and chatter, they don't have the same impact that you do. They don't have the same platform, the same authority. I mean, I think those other cities are really missing out if they don't have a voice.
I agree with you. Houston should have a critic. LA should have a critic. Every city should have a critic.
And there were more 30 years ago than there are now. They peaked in the 80s, I would think, when there were maybe 30 or 35, something like that. I would like to add two comments to what's been said.
Sure.
One is, I forgot what I was going to say. I wanted to make, I know what I wanted to make. You said you can't go on writing about individual building after individual building if it gets to be too many. What you can then do, and I'm sure you've done it, is step back and throw the framework around a little bit larger thing and talk about all those buildings as one field of buildings and why are they all have this common problem and don't have this common problem. And I don't write as frequently anymore, but the article that had the most influence and was most widely read that I've written in years was when I took that area of the Seaport District, which has been redeveloped very rapidly, and just pointed out, going back to the history of when it was originally, it was filled land, and then it was railroad tiding tracks and houses and things like that. At every stage of its development over time, nobody was thinking ahead. And so everything was done wrong all the way through to the beginning. And I think it's the best article I've been able to write in a long time. And it was not my usual article about the physical world that I'm so concerned about. It was also the larger than, well, a neighborhood is a physical world too, but it's a larger way of looking at it. I think the Dallas Morning News has hired a new critic replacing David Dillon, who was someone many of us knew. Right. And I think that if you go back not very far, when Ada Louise Huxtable became critic at the New York Times in maybe 63 or 4 or something like that, she was the only one in the country. There had been one or two before her, but not at the same time. So the world has survived without architecture critics, and it may be that there will again be a demand for them, because there was a real demand for them at that time in the 1980s when they were sort of reaching a crest, because nobody else was thinking and talking about what had made good environment and what didn't.
I mean, we should keep in mind it's not just that there are fewer architecture critics than there used to be. There are fewer arts critics, music critics. When I came to the Inquirer, we had a dance critic, we had 3 classical music critics, we had 2 popular music critics, we had 2 fine arts critics. Our culture staff has been decimated, and it's migrated to various, specialty websites. It's great that they're doing it, but again, newspapers are this rare mass market institution that serves a wide audience, a general interest audience.
Last question for both of you, and then we're going to open to questions from the audience. There's another generation of architecture critics that's out there. Mark Lamster at the Dallas Morning News, Alexandra Lang, who writes for Curbed. What advice do you have for them who do you think they should read, and how should they try to continue to show that architecture matters and architecture criticism matters? What if you had 30 seconds or a minute, what would you say? What would be the essential advice that you would give to them?
I'm sure they've read all the right books, but I would say always go to the building, always go to the site. I mean, there are some critics I know in Europe who don't always visit the site and see or visit the building. And you could look at it on Google Earth. You can look at the pictures, which a lot of magazine writers do, but there is no substitute for being present and experience this place that Bob talked about and the context. And we know that photographs lie, renderings lie. You have to see it with your own eyes.
There was a period when color photography came into architectural magazines, when all the architects turned on a dime and started making colored buildings. And I wrote an article then that I still kind of treasure. That there was a house by Richard Meyer, the ill-fated Richard Meyer, in Connecticut. And it occurred to me that the house was not the end product of the design process. The photograph, which went all around the world, in which every architect and every student of architecture knew in one way or another, the freestanding chimney next to the White House. And I think that's, I agree with you so completely. You must experience the building. You must inhabit the space. You must be in it. That's the only way you can understand architecture. You have to be in it because it's made to be in. That's why it's made in the first place. And then you go outside and you see, what is its relationship? Is it trying to show off that it's more expensive than this building, or is it trying to sell more of this kind of thing? I'm being silly, but all the different areas in which a building can be in context with other buildings. And it's so different from painting. A painting is in a frame. It can go in one museum. It can go in another museum. It can be stolen from the Gardner Museum. And it's still the same painting. A house or a building, a Frank Lloyd Wright house that has been built 2 or 3 times, that's been done with his houses on other sites and for other owners, are never quite right. You must understand the relation of the building to its surroundings. And the surroundings are, again, this is many different kinds of things you might choose to write about. You write about what might make a case that would be useful.
Can we have a hand, please, for our laureates?
Wow, that's very nice.
We'd like to take questions from the audience. Yes, there are mics.
Hi, congratulations, and thank you for this wonderful talk. Can you talk about your process? Are you working on multiple articles at the same time, weeks out, or are you writing a new article each week?
Well, I have a weekly column, so I'm always on deadline. And then I have a second column, which is kind of a history column, sort of what Bob described. I write that every other week, so I have about 6 columns a month, plus the occasional news story. So I'm juggling a lot of things in the air. And, I spend a lot of time on my bike going to look at projects to see what's coming. I keep like a big, detailed flow chart of things that are being finished, things that are being announced. Because I like to write my columns when, I like to say when the wave is cresting, when there's the most interest in that particular building or project. And then, when can I get interviews? When can I tour it? When can it be photographed? A lot of buildings, like there's a new 1,000-foot-high Comcast tower in Philadelphia. Well, people have moved into it, but it's still a construction site,
Sure.
So it makes it problematic to review. So, when can it be photographed? Anyway, so I have all these balls in the air, and I'm scanning all these other websites, I'm scanning the Facebook pages, and I want to catch people's interest. And so I always, like the Friday before my column, which actually runs on a Friday, I'll decide I'm going to do this column, and then I'll work on that. But sometimes I might make a complete U-turn if something happens.
I haven't done anything that regular for a long time. I did for some years write a column every week and collaborate with Peter on the before and afters. And also was trying to maintain a life as a father and a housekeeper and teaching in far-flung places like Michigan School of Architecture and two or three others. And it's amazing to me how much you can do when you're a certain age that you can't do anymore. I've reached an age now which I won't name, even though it's been bruited about. I can't think as fast, type as fast, get around as fast, do anything as fast. And so I am now spacing things out much more. You could say I'm semi-retired if you wanted to. I'm spacing things out. And much more often than in the past, the Globe will make a suggestion. Wouldn't it be nice if you wrote about such and such, because they would like to be getting more of me, which is nice. I think they also value a freelance because they don't have to pay me retirement benefits or health benefits or any of those things. And they are desperately cutting staff. I mean, it doesn't affect me at all because I've been doing it so long now that they just take me for granted. But it's been brutal, the cutting of staff, editorial staff, writing staff, the people who used to be freelancers who used to write in on every aspect of culture and art so frequently. Now you can't keep track of that stuff at all. So it's all going to shake out in some kind of new media. The Globe will certainly close its paper edition within the next 5 years. I'd be amazed if it didn't. Even though it makes more money out of the paper edition than it does out of the digital edition. It foresees that that's not going to go on forever. Right. And as a writer, and I guess if this is true of you too, and you too, when I read my work in the digital edition, it's always better than it was in the paper edition. There's more room for photographs. There's more room to do a nice layout. You're not trapped by some other story that's got its thumb in the hat of your story or something like that. I think there will always be architectural criticism in the sense that we've talked about it, but it's going to be, like everything else, evolving.
Other questions? Yes, sir, right there.
Here, we have a microphone. Thank you and congratulations. Both of you have been looking at the architectural urbanism scene for a very long time. What stands out as sort of a primary cause of optimism and also of pessimism about the current times versus the past?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. I think there's much more interest in architecture as forming a community, a village, an entity of some kind. And architecture is thought about as a contribution to something larger. That began in the preservation movement back in the 1960s primarily, and now it has just permeated through all aspects of architecture and design, I think. And there's nobody is embarrassed to do a building that in some way harks back to old-fashioned architecture now, if it's done with imagination and appropriateness to the current situation and the current program for the building and all those things. Nobody's embarrassed anymore to take advantage of all the wonderful architecture in the past. So I would say that's one. There'd be many things I could list, but that would certainly be one.
Well, I guess I'm a little more pessimistic. I feel like there's a huge divide in architectural quality between buildings that are built for universities and museums and things that are built in the private sphere. And I do feel that the whole nature of the way things are financed, I'm talking about apartment buildings and retail buildings, the way they're financed, the way they're developed, everything's done for the short term, and there are very, very few developers who build to hold, and that means that they're not thinking beyond, the 5 years it takes to sell it to a big management company, and I think that has a tremendous impact on the design. So, you know, except in very niche markets that are going after extremely wealthy people, there's not much really solid architecture. It's not that there never is, and I recently praised a design in Philadelphia, a 30-story tower, you know, built by big national developers, but they knew, it was in the center of the city, and they knew that they wanted to get a sort of young, cool tenant, and they had to, you know, spice up the building a little bit, and they did. And you know, it wasn't great architecture by any means, but it was definitely a cut above, and it had some other good qualities. But that doesn't happen often enough, unfortunately.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
Here you go. Sir. Sorry. Ideally, your insights and observations help your readers more fully appreciate the environment, but we would also hope that it would lead to positive changes in the way things are done in the future. Can you cite any examples of things that you've written in either the short term or long term had an influence to make cities better places?
I think only by supporting other people who are trying to make cities better places. I was a big advocate of the preservation movement when it was getting underway, and there was, you know, I'll try to say this briefly, but I was saying it to someone else tonight. When I went to architecture school in the early 1960s, architectural design was a cult. It might have been a religion. And the students who came there were dressed, they were like the Marines. They came with a new uniform. They were kept up late at night. Deadlines were switched at back and forth at different times. Aspersions were cast on any values of your parents, God forbid. I mean, it was a cult, and it was the formation of a cult by discipline in the same way that it was for the Marines. So if one thing has changed, I think that doesn't exist anymore. I think there is a general understanding on the part of anyone sophisticated that modern architecture, modernist architecture, did go too far in the direction of being a cult and having a series of values that were known only to those who spoke the language, and the language was incomprehensible. One of my favorite articles that I've ever written was an article for Architectural Record magazine, just quoting all of the incredible things that had been written and stated in totally incomprehensible language for poor students who probably can't even an ordinary book beyond a comic book today, but they're asked to read these things that usually read like Martian translations of a Germanic text, introducing a French work of substantive philosophy.
Archibabble, we call it.
Archibabble,
right?
yeah.
Okay. In the back? Yes.
Congratulations to you both, and thanks for a terrific discussion. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Washington, D.C. area, but I'm wondering if either of you would offer an opinion on the best or the worst buildings in the city.
I'm not an expert on D.C. I was walking around a lot today, and I did feel like it was the world's biggest office park and dullest.
Yeah.
Whenever walking around Noma, and like when you come in on the train from the north, and you see those enormous block-sized buildings, I just wonder if they're going to run out of window patterns, there's just so many ways that you can make these blocky buildings different. They try to maximize every inch of the floor plate, and they're all the same shape. So it's pretty dispiriting. Even though I will say the construction quality here is better than Philadelphia, and the materials tend to be better, but there's a lot of dullness.
Huh?
I don't know how to, I mean, I'm fond of the Jefferson Memorial and some other older buildings. It's very hard. It's very hard to range your head over so many things, you know, so many buildings here. I'm sure I've seen many buildings that I like very much, although I don't know Washington at all well. I've never lived here or worked here. I would say that something that was done well is the subway system when it was originally done. I understand there are problems with it now, and it's aging, and that happens with a lot of them. But I was very impressed with that achievement when it was first achieved, and I would say that's the kind of thing that will help a city for sure. And I wish to hell we had done something like that in Boston, because the system is just collapsing, and it is in New York as well.
Of course, that system is designed by a Chicago architect, Harry Weiss.
I was waiting for that.
But you know what? I think one of the things we're talking about here is not just buildings, not just places, but civilization. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I, take Metro in and I see those gorgeous concrete vaults, that's civilization. Mm-hmm. That's a public realm that's fabulous and meaningful. And I think that's a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. Mm-hmm. We are what we build, and we build what we are. Mm-hmm. And it's really been a pleasure to have this discussion with these two brilliant critics and to evoke the memory of Vincent Scully. And I just want to thank all of you in the Building Museum for hosting this event and underscoring the importance of architecture criticism. So thank you very much.